On a rain-slicked Tuesday night in New York City, inside the velvet-draped walls of the Onyx Room, 5 men walked in to destroy a king. Their target, Arthur Kensington, a titan of industry whose net worth eclipsed the GDP of small nations. They were professionals, silent, swift, and utterly ruthless. They expected alarms and security. What they never accounted for was the quiet black waitress clearing plates in the corner. A woman named Zora Monroe. They saw a servant. They were about to meet a reckoning. The Onyx Room wasn't for the new money crowd. It was a sanctuary of old-world discretion on the Upper East Side, a place for people whose names were etched onto university libraries and hospital wings. Through this curated tranquility moved Zora, a ghost in a crisp black uniform. At 27, she had mastered the art of invisibility, a skill honed not just by her job, but by a world that often looked straight through women who looked like her. Her movements were economical, her expression placid. She was, by all accounts, an exemplary waitress. But beneath the surface, Zora was a fortress of observation. She catalogued everyone. The subtle tells, the tightening of a jaw, the flicker of an eye. It was a skill from a past she kept locked away, buried deep. Around her neck, tucked beneath her uniform, she wore a simple, worn silver locket. It was smooth from years of anxious habit, the only piece of her old life she allowed herself to keep. At 8:15 p.m., Arthur Kensington entered, and the room's gravitational pull shifted. He was power personified, CEO of a sprawling global conglomerate. He was tall, impeccably dressed, but a weariness haunted his sharp blue eyes. He was shown to his usual table, a secluded alcove in the back. It had been his late wife's favorite spot. Zora approached his table. "Good evening, Mr. Kensington. Can I get you something to start with?" He didn't look up from the menu. "A glass of the Macallan 25. Neat." His voice was a low baritone accustomed to command. As she turned to leave, he spoke again, his voice softer. "And, Ms. Monroe." Zora paused. It was rare for him to use her name. He finally lifted his eyes to meet hers, analytical and piercing. "Is the cocoa vin as good as it was last month?" It was a test, his way of asking if the world he tried to keep perfectly ordered was still holding its shape. "Chef Dubois is in fine form tonight, sir," she replied calmly. "I believe you'll find it exceeds expectations." A flicker of approval crossed his lips before vanishing. Zora retreated to the bar, a strange tension prickling her senses. Something felt different tonight. At the bar, as she procured the expensive scotch, she glanced at her reflection. The face that looked back was a stranger's mask, plain, unassuming, easily forgotten. No one would ever guess the violence her hands were capable of. The silver locket felt suddenly cold against her skin. It was a reminder of a vow sealed in blood and tears: she would never be a victim again. She would always be the one who saw the storm coming. At 8:43 p.m., the front doorbell chimed with a sharp, discordant clang. 5 men entered in a staggered, coordinated sequence. The first 2, dressed in dark, functional suits, bypassed the host station and took up positions covering the entrance and the main dining room. The next 2 were larger, their broad shoulders stretching their jackets, unable to hide the bulge of body armor and holstered weapons. One stood near the bar, the other by the kitchen doors, cutting off the staff's primary escape route. The restaurant's warm atmosphere evaporated, replaced by a cold, prickling fear. Forks paused, and conversations faltered. Zora was behind the bar, her hands never stopping as she polished a glass. Her mind, however, was racing. This wasn't a robbery. Robbers were loud and chaotic. These men were silent, organized, and their focus was singular. Her eyes flicked from man to man, noting their earpieces, their positions. They were creating a kill box, and at its center was Arthur Kensington. The 5th man entered, clearly the leader. He had the sharp, predatory features of a hawk and moved with an arrogant grace. His eyes locked onto Kensington's table with chilling intensity. This was Victor Rostova, known in the circles that hired him as the Ghost, a specialist in extractions of the most brutal kind. Zora's blood ran cold. She recognized the formation, a classic box and seal tactic. She'd seen it diagrammed in worn-out training manuals in a life she fought daily to forget. Her hand instinctively went to the locket beneath her shirt, a familiar anchor in a rising sea of adrenaline. Rostova glided towards Kensington's table. Kensington had been observing the scene in the reflection of his scotch glass. When Rostova arrived, he didn't look surprised, merely annoyed. He took a slow sip of his drink. "Rostova," Kensington said, his voice laced with contempt. "I assume you're not here to discuss the quality of the cocoa vin." Rostova's smile was a cruel slash. "Mr. Kensington. My employer feels our last conversation was left unfinished. He's requested a more personal debriefing." At his gesture, one of the large men pulled a compact suppressed pistol. Its presence was a scream in the silent room. "Phones on the table." "Now," the man at the bar commanded. Patrons began shakily placing their phones on the white tablecloths. Zora's mind was a supercomputer. Kitchen door blocked, main entrance controlled. Objective, extraction, not assassination. Otherwise, Kensington would already be dead. She saw the man by the kitchen doors glance towards her, his eyes dismissive. She was just part of the scenery. It was the mistake she counted on. Rostova leaned in closer to Kensington. "We can do this the easy way, Julian, or the hard way. The hard way involves me redecorating this lovely establishment with the blood of these innocent people. You'll come with us, and you'll bring the Chimera key." Kensington's composure finally cracked at the mention of the Chimera key. A flicker of genuine shock crossed his face. Rostova saw it. "Ah," he purred. "So you do have it on you." "Excellent," he snapped his fingers, and the two large men moved to grab Kensington. This was the moment. Zora set the wine glass down on the bar with a soft, deliberate click. In the crushing silence, it was everything. The man at the bar turned his head towards the sound, his brow furrowed in annoyance. In that split second of distraction, Zora Monroe ceased to be a waitress. The invisible woman was gone. Her world narrowed to threats, angles, and opportunities. Her first move was a symphony of brutal efficiency. One moment she was behind the bar, the next she was flowing over it. In her right hand, she held a heavy, full bottle of bourbon, an object her body had registered as the best available tool. The enforcer had only a moment to register the impossible sight of the waitress coming at him through the air. The bottle connected with the side of his head with a sickening, wet thump. The 250-pound man collapsed in a boneless heap, unconscious before he hit the ground. A collective gasp went through the restaurant. Rostova, hauling a stunned Kensington to his feet, froze. His perfectly orchestrated operation had just been derailed by the help. "What the hell?" the second enforcer near the kitchen barked, turning his weapon toward Zora. This was the opening she had created. Zora kicked a heavy bar stool, sending it skittering across the floor into the man's path. He instinctively sidestepped, a micro-correction that cost him a precious half-second. It was all she needed. She lunged forward, staying low, and slammed through the swinging double doors to the kitchen just as the first gunshot erupted, splintering the wood where her head had been a moment before. Inside, the terrified kitchen staff huddled in a corner. "Out the back door. Now." Zora's voice was a clipped, hard command. They scrambled to obey. The enforcer kicked the swinging doors open, his pistol held ready. "Crazy bitch, you're dead." Zora was already moving. She grabbed a cast-iron skillet from the stovetop, still hot, and threw it like a discus. The heavy skillet clipped him on the wrist of his gun hand. He grunted in pain, his aim wavering. As he fought to re-aim, Zora lunged. She drove her shoulder hard into his sternum, using his size against him. Her left hand clamped onto his gun wrist, controlling its direction. Her right hand, balled into a fist, delivered 3 rapid, brutal strikes to his throat. He gagged, his grip on the gun loosening. Zora twisted his wrist, and the gun clattered to the floor. She hooked her leg behind his, sweeping him backward. He fell hard, his head connecting with the corner of a steel prep table with a sickening crack. 2 down. Zora stood for a single second, breathing hard. The locket on her chest felt white-hot. This was the part of herself she had tried to kill. The legacy of her trainer, a man who had beaten a single lesson into her DNA, hesitation is death. Act, react, control. She scooped the fallen Glock from the floor. Her hands knew the feel of it instantly. Back in the dining room, Rostova's frustration had curdled into white-hot fury. He shoved Kensington back into the booth. Stay. The 2 remaining scouts had drawn their weapons and were advancing cautiously on the kitchen doors. What is she? One whispered. Doesn't matter, Rostova hissed into his earpiece. Subdue her. Now. Zora heard the whisper of their shoes. They would expect her to come out firing, so she did the opposite. On the stove, a pot of water was at a rolling boil. She grabbed it with a dish towel, moved to the side of the door, and waited. Slowing her breathing, she kicked the door open and simultaneously hurled the pot of boiling water in a wide, sweeping arc. A scream of agony tore through the restaurant as the scalding water hit one of the men full in the face. He dropped his gun, clawing at his skin. The other scout, spattered but not directly hit, flinched back in shock. Zora exploded from the doorway. She ignored the screaming man and drove straight for his partner. She slammed the heavy base of the pistol's grip upward into his chin. His head snapped back, and he crumpled to the floor. 3 and 4 down. Now it was just Rostova. Zora pivoted, the gun now leveled, her stance perfect. She and Rostova stood 20 feet apart, separated by overturned tables and terrified patrons. Kensington watched from his booth, his face a mask of disbelief. Rostova had his own weapon out, aimed directly at Kensington's head. A stalemate. Drop it, Rostova said, his voice dangerously calm. Drop it now, or the billionaire gets a third eye. Zora's gaze was unyielding. You walk out that door, right now. You leave, and you live, she said, her voice steady. Rostova laughed, a harsh, grating sound. You have no idea who you're dealing with, little girl. You're a waitress. I don't care if your name is Caesar, Zora replied, her voice dropping to an icy whisper. You brought your war into my house. You threatened my guests. I am asking you, politely, one last time, to leave. For the first time, Rostova truly saw her. Not the uniform, not the servant. He saw the set of her shoulders, the unwavering focus in her eyes, the professional way she held her weapon. He saw a predator looking back at him. And in that moment, a sliver of doubt lodged itself in his heart. Who was this woman? The stalemate stretched, thin and brittle. Rostova held his gun steady on Kensington, but his eyes were locked on Zora, his mind struggling to categorize the threat she posed. You've made a serious miscalculation, waitress, Rostova sneered, trying to reclaim control. Zora's eyes darted for a fraction of a second to the large mirror behind the bar. No sirens yet. It was still just them. This doesn't have to end with anyone else getting hurt, she said. It wasn't a plea, it was a statement of fact. Kensington, accustomed to being the primary actor in any room, slowly began to push himself up from the booth. Stay down. Zora and Rostova snapped in unison, their heads whipping toward him. In that shared moment of distraction, the dynamic shifted. It was the opening Rostova needed. He fired, not at Kensington, but at the floor in front of the booth. The shot was thunderous. Wood chips exploded. The shot was a diversion, a sensory overload. As Zora's eyes instinctively flickered towards the sound, Rostova moved, diving sideways behind a heavy overturned oak table. You're good, he called out, his voice muffled. I'll give you that. But you're one person. I have nothing but time. Zora knew he was right. She had to end this now. She began to move, using the line of booths as cover, circling. It became a deadly game of cat and mouse. Who trained you? Rostova called out, probing. Zora remained silent, moving like smoke. Near the front, she saw a heavy, solid bronze statue on the host station. An idea, desperate and dangerous, began to form. Rostova was growing impatient. He popped up for a quick look. Nothing. He was about to move when a flicker of movement caught his eye, a reflection in the rain-streaked front window. He saw Zora's form. He reacted instantly, rising and firing 2 quick shots in that direction. The window shattered, exploding inwards. But Zora wasn't there. He had seen her black serving jacket thrown over the bronze statue, held up for a second to create a misleading reflection. While he was firing at the phantom, she was sprinting low and fast directly at his position from the side. Rostova realized his mistake the moment he pulled the trigger. He spun, but she was already on him, crashing into him with the force of a linebacker. They went down in a tangle of limbs, his gun flying from his hand. Now it was primal. No guns, just skill and will. Rostova was strong, but Zora was a whirlwind of controlled violence. She wasn't trying to overpower him, she was systematically dismantling him. An elbow strike to his ribs made him gasp. The heel of her hand drove up into the bridge of his nose with a sickening crunch. He swung a wild fist, but she ducked under it, locking his arm in a brutal joint lock. Rostova screamed, a raw, animal sound of agony. The key, where is the key? He gurgled, blood filling his mouth. Zora ignored him, increasing the pressure on his arm. This was for the terrified patrons, for the sanctity of her refuge, for the promise she had made over her brother's grave. With a final, sickening pop, she dislocated his elbow. He collapsed, all the fight gone out of him. Zora stood up, breathing heavily. She scanned the room. The 4 other men were down. The patrons were watching her with a mixture of terror and awe. And Arthur Kensington was slowly getting to his feet, his blue eyes fixed on her with an expression she couldn't begin to decipher. The fight was over. But as she looked from the defeated Rostova to the bewildered billionaire, a name echoed in her memory. A name Rostova had spoken that now changed everything. My employer. An employer who would want the Chimera key. A man named Marcus Thorne. Her blood ran cold. Robert Thorne. She knew that name. And the knowledge of who he was and what he meant to her past sent a tremor of shock through her more debilitating than any punch or bullet. The sounds of distant sirens finally grew closer. Zora stood in the center of the chaos, her adrenaline receding, leaving behind a deep exhaustion and the familiar metallic tang of violence. All she could feel was the seismic shock of that name, Marcus Thorne. Her mind was a maelstrom of memories. A dusty community center in a rough part of the city. A group of scared, angry kids, herself among them, lost after her older brother, David, was killed over a $20 debt. And a kind, soft-spoken man who had shown up one day like an angel. Marcus Thorne. He wasn't just a benefactor, he was a savior. He had used his own money to renovate the center, build a new boxing gym, and fund the very self-defense program that had forged her skills. Thorne had seen the raw rage in a 16-year-old Zora and had given her an outlet, a future. The skills that had just saved a billionaire's life were a direct gift from the man who had sent these killers. The irony was a physical blow. Ms. Monroe, Arthur Kensington's voice cut through her reverie. He was standing a few feet away, his gaze intense. Are you all right? Zora could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. She had just crippled the man sent by her savior, all to protect, who, exactly? He said they wanted the Chimera key, Kensington stated, his voice low. What is it? Rostova, lying on the floor, let out a pained, wheezing laugh. He calls it insurance. Thorne calls it theft. The intellectual property of a project that could have changed the world. Before this vulture, he glared at Kensington, gutted his company and stole it. Zora's eyes snapped back to Kensington. Thorne's project was reckless, unstable, Kensington said, his jaw tight. It would have destabilized the entire global financial market. I didn't steal it. I contained it. You did what was necessary to maintain your monopoly. Rostova snarled. You ruined him. A good man. You left him with nothing. Every word was a hammer blow to Zora's world. A good man. She knew Marcus Thorne was a good man. She was living proof of his goodness. And this man, Arthur Kensington, had destroyed him. She was protecting the villain of her own savior story. The silver locket beneath her shirt felt impossibly heavy. It contained a tiny picture of her and David. Everything she had learned was in service of honoring that memory and paying back Thorne's kindness. What had she just done? Kensington saw the shift in her eyes, the dangerous wavering of her allegiance. Ms. Monroe, he said urgently. The world is not a simple place of good men and bad men. Thorne wanted to burn it down to build his utopia. I am trying to keep it running. The approaching sirens were louder now. The police would be here any second. They would see a black waitress with a gun and a room full of bodies. The story would be written for her. But in this moment, the choice was still hers. Kensington's words cut through her conflict. Look around this room. These people, you didn't save me. You saved them. Her gaze drifted to the patrons. He was right. Her actions, born from a personal vow, had shielded everyone. Her loyalty wasn't to Kensington or to the memory of Thorne. It was to the innocent. It was to the promise that no one in her presence would ever be a helpless victim again. The conflict in her eyes sharpened into resolve. She took 3 steps and stood over Rostova. She crouched down, her voice a low command. The key. Mr. Kensington won't be leaving with you. But your employer still wants his property. So you're going to give me a message for him. What message? Rostova rasped. You tell Marcus Thorne that the Chimera key is now in the hands of a third party, Zora said, her voice cold and clear. It is secure. If he or anyone else ever makes a move against Mr. Kensington or anyone in this room again, its contents will be released to every major news agency on the planet. Kensington's eyes widened. She was bluffing. She didn't have the key. You don't have it, Rostova challenged weakly. Zora leaned in closer. Your men are alive. I could have killed every single one of you. Do I seem like a person who bluffs? You tell him David's sister has it. He'll know what that means. The mention of her brother was a key. This was personal. Rostova simply nodded. Zora stood up and faced Kensington, holding out the Glock, grip first. He stared at the gun, then at her. He understood. She hadn't chosen him, she had created a stalemate that protected him better than any bodyguard. She now held the leverage over both of them. He didn't take the gun. The police will need to take that, he said quietly. Let my lawyers handle it. He reached into a hidden pocket in his suit and pulled out a minuscule data drive, no bigger than a thumbnail. The Chimera key. Without a word, he pressed it into her hand. It was an act of absolute, insane trust. You called it a third party, he said as the first police officers burst through the door. Now you are one. The police swarmed in. Slowly, deliberately, Zora placed the Glock on a table and raised her empty hands, her right fist tightly clenched around the tiny drive that had caused all this chaos. She was no longer just Zora Monroe, the waitress. She was something new. A week later, Zora stood in Arthur Kensington's office, a glass cage at the apex of the city. I owe you a debt, he began. A significant sum has been transferred to a private account that will ensure your freedom. But I'm not offering you a job as my bodyguard. A bodyguard reacts. I need someone who acts first. My empire has 1,000 enemies. I need a new department, one that operates in the gray spaces. Your department. You will answer only to me. It was an offer of immense power, a kingdom of shadows. I accept, she said, on 2 conditions. Kensington's eyebrow arched. First, Zora stated firmly, Marcus Thorne is to be left alone. The stalemate I created holds. After a moment, Kensington gave a single, sharp nod. Done. Second, she continued, I keep the Chimera key. It's my leverage, Mr. Kensington, to ensure the actions your company takes don't cross a line I'm unwilling to defend. She was not asking to be his weapon, but to be his check and balance. For a long moment, the billionaire was silent. Then, a slow, genuine smile spread across his face, a look of pure, unadulterated respect. He had expected a soldier but had found a strategist. Welcome to Kensington Industries, Ms. Monroe, he said, extending his hand. Zora took it. As their hands clasped, a new contract was sealed. The Waitress was a story left behind in an empty restaurant. In her place stood the director of his most secret operations, a queen on a board of her own making, forever guarding the line between protection and perdition.